The T-34 was a Soviet medium tank that had a profound and lasting effect on the field of tank design. Although its armor and armament were surpassed later in the war, it has been often credited as the most effective, efficient and influential tank design of the Second World War. At its introduction, the T-34 possessed an unprecedented combination of firepower, mobility, protection and ruggedness. Its 76.2 mm high-velocity tank gun provided substantial increase in firepower over any of its contemporaries. Its heavy sloped armor was difficult to penetrate by most contemporary anti-tank weapons. When first encountered in 1941, the German tank General von Kleist called it the finest tank in the world, and Heinz Guderian confirmed the T-34's vast superiority over existing German armor of the period. The T-34 was the mainstay of Soviet armored forces throughout the Second World War. Its design allowed it to be continuously refined to meet the constantly evolving needs of the Eastern Front. As the war went on, it became more capable, but also quicker and cheaper to produce. Soviet industry would eventually produce over 80,000 T-34s of all variants, allowing steadily greater numbers to be fielded as the war progressed despite the loss of thousands in combat against the German Wehrmacht. Replacing many light and medium tanks in Red Army service, it was the most produced tank of the war, as well as the second most produced tank of all time. Its evolutionary development led directly to the T-54 55th series of tanks, and from that to the T-62, T-72, and T-90 tanks that, along with several Chinese tanks based on the T-55, formed the backbone of many armies even today. Widely exported following the war, T-34 variants were still in service in at least 27 countries as of 1996. Development and production. Origins in 1939. The most numerous Soviet tank models were the T-26 infantry tank and the BT series of fast tanks. The T-26 was slow-moving, designed to keep pace with infantry on the ground. The BT tanks were cavalry tanks, fast-moving and light, designed for maneuver warfare. Both were Soviet developments of foreign designs from the early 1930s. The T-26 was based on the British Vickers 6-ton, and the BT tanks were based on a design from American engineer J. Walter Christie. In 1937, the Red Army had assigned engineer Mikhail Koshkin to lead a new team to design a replacement for the BT tanks at the Kharkov Komintern locomotive plant. The prototype tank, designated A-20, was specified with 20 mm of armor, a 45 mm gun, and the new model V2-34 engine, using less flammable diesel fuel in a V12 configuration designed by Konstantin Chelpin. It also had an 8x6-wheel convertible drive similar to the BT tank's 8x2, which allowed it to run on wheels without caterpillar tracks. This feature had greatly saved on maintenance and repair of the unreliable tank tracks of the early 1930s, and allowed tanks to exceed 85 km/h on roads, but gave no advantage in combat, and its complexity made it difficult to maintain. By 1937-38, track design had improved and the designers considered it a waste of space, weight, and maintenance resources, despite the road speed advantage. The A-20 also incorporated previous research into sloped armor. Its all-round sloped armor plates were more likely to deflect rounds than perpendicular armor. During the Battle of Lake Carson in July 1938 and the battles of Kharkov in 1939, an undeclared border war with Japan on the frontier with occupied Manchuria. The Soviets deployed numerous tanks against the Imperial Japanese Army. Although the IJA Type 95 cargo light tanks had diesel engines, the Red Army's T-26 and BT tanks used petrol engines which, while common in tank designs of the time, often burst into flames when hit by IJA tank killer teams using Molotov cocktails. Poor quality welds in the Soviet armor plates left small gaps between them, and flaming petrol from the Molotov cocktails easily seeped into the fighting and engine compartment. Portions of the armor plating that had been assembled with rivets also proved to be vulnerable. The Soviet tanks were also easily destroyed by the Japanese Type 95 tanks' 37mm gunfire, despite the low velocity of that gun, or at any other slightest provocation. The use of riveted armor led to a problem called spalling, whereby the impact of enemy shells, even if they failed to disable the tank or kill the crew on their own, would cause the rivets to break off and become projectiles inside the tank. After these battles, Koshkin convinced Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to let him develop a second prototype, a more heavily armed and armored universal tank that reflected the lessons learned and could replace both the T-26 and the BT tanks. Koshkin named the second prototype A-32, after its 32mm of frontal armor. It had an L-10 76.2mm gun, and the same model V2-34 diesel. Both were tested in field trials at Kubinka in 1939, with the heavier A-32 proving to be as mobile as the A-20. A still heavier version of the A-32, with 45mm of front armor, wider tracks, and a newer L-11 76.2mm gun, was approved for production as the T-34. Koshkin chose the name after the year 1934, when he began to formulate his ideas about the new tank, and to commemorate that year's decree expanding the armored force and appointing Sergei Ordjonik to head tank production. The valuable lessons from Lake Kherson and Kharkov regarding armor protection, mobility, quality welding, and main guns were incorporated into the new T-34 tank, which represented substantial improvement over the BT and T-26 tanks in all four areas. Koshkin's team completed two prototype T-34s in January 1940. In April and May, they underwent a grueling 2,000-kilometer drive from Kharkov to Moscow for a demonstration for the Kremlin leaders, to the Mannerheim line in Finland, and back to Kharkov via Minsk and Kiev. Some drivetrain shortcomings were identified and corrected. Initial production political pressure came from conservative elements in the army to redirect resources into building the older T-26 and BT tanks, or to cancel T-34 production pending completion of the more advanced T-34M design. This pressure was brought to bear by the developer of the KV-1 and his two tanks, which were in competition with the T-34. Resistance from the military command and concerns about high production cost were finally overcome by anxieties about the poor performance of Soviet tanks in the Winter War in Finland, and the effectiveness of German tanks during the Battle of France. The first production T-34s were completed in September 1940, completely replacing the production of the T-26, the BT series, and the multi-turreted T-28 medium tank at the KHPZ plant. Koshkin died of pneumonia at the end of that month, and the T-34's drivetrain developer Alexander Morozov was appointed chief designer. The T-34 posed new challenges for Soviet industry. It had heavier armor than any medium tank produced to date, and there were problems with defective armor plates. Only company commanders' tanks could be fitted with radios. Due to their expense and short supply, the rest of of the tank crews in each company signaled with flags. The L-11 gun did not live up to expectations, so the Graben Design Bureau at Gorky Factory N92 designed the superior F-34 76.2mm gun. No bureaucrat would approve production of the new gun, but Gorky and KHPZ started producing it anyway. Official permission only came from the State Defense Committee after troops praised the weapon's performance in combat against the Germans. Production of this first T-34 series, the model 1940, totaled only about 400 before production was switched to the model 1941, with the F-34 gun, 9RS radio set, and even thicker armor. Mass production sub-assemblies for the T-34 originated at several plants. Kharkov Diesel Factory N75 supplied the Model V2-34 engine. Leningrad Kirovsky Factory made the original L-11 gun, and the Dynamo Factory in Moscow produced electrical components. Tanks were initially built at KHPZ N183 in early 1941 at the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, and starting in July at Krasnoy Sormovo Factory N112 in Gorky. After Germany's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, the Wehrmacht's rapid advances forced the evacuation of Soviet tank factories eastwards of the Ural Mountains, an undertaking of immense scale and haste that presented enormous logistic difficulties and was extremely punishing to the workers involved. Alexander Morozov personally supervised the evacuation of all skilled engineers and laborers, machinery and stock from KHPZ to re-establish the factory at the site of the Zhezhinsky Ural Railcar Factory in Nizhny Tagil, renamed Stalin Ural Tank Factory N183. The Kirovsky factory, evacuated just weeks before the Germans surrounded Leningrad, moved with the Kharkov diesel factory to the Stalin tractor factory in Chelyabinsk, soon to be nicknamed Tankorgrad. The workers and machinery from Leningrad's Voroshilov tank factory N174 were incorporated into the Ural factory and the new Omsk factory N174. The Orjonikidze Ural Heavy Machine Tool Works in Sverdlovsk absorbed workers and machines from several small machine shops in the path of German forces. While these factories were being rapidly moved, the industrial complex surrounding the Zhezhinsky tractor factory in Stalingrad continued to work double shifts throughout the period of withdrawal to make up for production lost, and produced 40% of all T-34s during the period. As the factory became surrounded by heavy fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, the situation grew desperate. Manufacturing innovations were necessitated by material shortages, and stories persist of unpainted T-34 tanks driven out of the factory directly to the battlefields around it. Stalingrad kept up production until September 1942. Soviet designers were aware of design deficiencies in the tank, but most of the desired remedies would have slowed tank production and so were not implemented. The only changes allowed on the production lines through to 1944 were those to make production simpler and cheaper. New methods were developed for automated welding and hardening the armor plate, including innovations by Professor Evgeny Patin. The design of the 76.2mm F-34 gun model 1941 was reduced from an initial 861 parts to 614. The initial narrow, cramped turrets, both the cast one and the one welded of rolled armor plates bent to shape, were since 1942 gradually replaced with the somewhat less cramped hexagonal one, as it was mostly cast with only a few simple flat armor plates welded in. This turret was actually faster to produce. Limited rubber supplies led to the adoption of all-steel, internally sprung road wheels, and a new clutch was added to an improved 5-speed transmission and engine, improving reliability. Over 2 years, the unit production cost of the T-34 was reduced from 269,500 rubles in 1941 to 193,000, and then to 135,000. Production time was cut in half by the end of 1942. Even though most experienced factory workers had been sent to the battlefield and were replaced by a mixed workforce that included 50% women, 15% boys, and 15% invalids and old men. Originally, beautifully crafted machines with excellent exterior finish comparable or superior to those in Western Europe or America. Later T-34s were much more roughly finished, however, this did not compromise mechanical reliability. In 1943, T-34 production had reached an average of 1,300 per month. This was the equivalent of 3 full-strength panzer divisions. By the end of 1945, over 57,300 T-34s had been built. 34,780 T-34 tanks in multiple variants with 76.2 mm guns in 1940–44, and another 22,609 of the revised T-34-85 model in 1944–45. The single largest producer was Factory N. 183, building 28,952 T-34s and T-34-85s from 1941 to 1945. The second largest was Krasnoyarsk or Muvo Factory N. 112 in Gorky, with 12,604 in the same period. At the start of the war, T-34s comprised about 4% of the Soviet tank arsenal, but by the end it made up at least 55% of tank production. Following the end of the war, a further 2,701 T-34s were built prior to the end of Soviet production. Under licensed production was restarted in Poland and Czechoslovakia, where 1,380 and 3,185 T-34-85s were made, respectively, by 1956. Altogether, as many as 84,070 T-34s are thought to have been built, plus 13,170 self-propelled guns built on T-34 chassis. It was the most produced tank of the Second World War, and the second most produced tank of all time, after its successor, the T-54 55th series.